Okay. We're doing it. You guys asked, and I am here to answer. I'm going to be comparing the M1 12.9-inch iPad Pro against Apple's all-new M2 MacBook Air. Welcome everybody to Apple Insider. It is Andrew here, and this is a great comparison. And I saw a lot of comments in my previous videos asking whether they should buy a iPad Pro or a MacBook Air. And I thought about it, and it makes a lot of sense. Especially when you look at the 256 gig storage configuration, these machines price out to be exactly the same. If you don't think about the keyboard on the iPad Pro side. But for the devices themselves, you can get a 128 gig iPad Pro for $10.99, or for $11.99 you get a 256 gig version. $11.99 is also where the 256 gig version of the MacBook Air starts, and they both start with 8 gigs of memory. So it puts them in very similar footing, and I'm going to try to help people make a decision of which is best for them in this video. So let's go ahead and start off with the design of these two machines. The new MacBook Air received a big new redesign. I'm a massive fan, and it even comes in these fun new colors. We have Starlight here, this kind of light goldish color that I'm actually a pretty big fan of, and Midnight, which a lot of people also love. It's got this really nice darker blue to it, but it does gather fingerprints a little bit. Of course, these come in space gray and silver as well. And we're looking at the iPad Pro. They only come in space gray and silver. So if you want a fun new color, you're going to have to go with the MacBook Air. But in terms of weight and everything like that, it's pretty interesting. See, the iPad weighs a lot less. This comes in at 1.5 pounds. And a MacBook Air, this weighs 2.7 pounds. So a lot more weight for a MacBook Air. But if you calculate the weight of Apple's Magic Keyboard, all of a sudden, the iPad Pro isn't so light. The iPad Pro with a Magic Keyboard comes in at 3.1 pounds. 3.1 pounds for this whole kit here, versus again, 2.7 for the MacBook Air. That makes the MacBook Air lighter than the iPad Pro. It also is thinner. Comparatively, the MacBook Air is quite a bit thinner than the iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard attached. But I will say, as we get into this comparison, you don't have to buy the Magic Keyboard. There are other keyboard options. You can get a lowly $20 Bluetooth keyboard and a cheap mouse and use both of them with an iPad Pro. You don't even need to use a mouse because it has a touchscreen. So though I talk about the Magic Keyboard a lot in this video, don't feel like you have to buy the Magic Keyboard. There are third-party keyboards like Bridge that are excellent and cheaper than the Magic Keyboard, or you can go all the way down just with a Bluetooth keyboard. They're all options. So there's just a huge range of price because a Magic Keyboard can cost over $300, or you can go cheap with a $20 Bluetooth keyboard. So it's really your call at what makes the most sense for you and your budget. Even though the iPad Pro weighs more and is thicker than the MacBook Air with this Magic Keyboard, it has the benefit of being able to transform from a full-on workstation type laptop, like this, to pulling this off and using it just as a tablet. So you can go from a whole device to just the tablet by itself. Then it becomes lighter and thinner than the MacBook Air. Depends on how you use it, but I just love that versatility of like, I want to use a tablet by itself, or I want to use a whole keyboard setup with a screen, anything like that. So it just depends on your workflow. iPad Pro has those downsides of being heavier and thicker, but it is more versatile and can transform from a tablet to a laptop. Moving on, we can talk about the ports on these two machines. And when it comes to ports, the MacBook Air wins hands down. The MacBook Air now has 3 ports, 4 if you count a headphone jack. But it has a MagSafe 3 port that you can use exclusively for charging, freeing up the 2 additional Type-C ports for USB or Thunderbolt connectivity. Connect a monitor, connect storage, connect a microphone, whatever you want through 2 ports. The iPad Pro, on the other hand, only has a single Thunderbolt port on it. So you have 1 port, which must be used for charging as well as connecting accessories. So it's basically going from 1 to 3 on the MacBook Air. The other difference, of course, is that there's still no headphone jack here on the iPad Pro. So if you want a headphone jack or additional ports, you do need to use some sort of USB hub to connect all those additional accessories. Now let's discuss the displays of these two machines. Starting with the MacBook Air. The MacBook Air has a 13.6-inch screen. That's 0.3 inches larger than the last generation MacBook Air. Apple's added several rows of pixels here at the top to accommodate the menu bar, allowing you to be able to get more screen real estate and put the notch in the middle on either side of the menu bar itself. The iPad Pro, on the other hand, has a 12.9-inch display. So 12.9 on the iPad Pro versus 13.6 on the MacBook Air. The MacBook Air is slightly larger of a screen, which could be a benefit. Well, it is a benefit. But on the other side, this is only a LED IPS display versus a mini LED display here on the iPad Pro. This is basically the cheapest Pro Display XDR display that you can get from Apple, and that's really saying something. It also has ProMotion, which up to 120 Hz refresh rate. The MacBook Air, on the other hand, only has a standard 60 Hz refresh rate. Using them side by side, you can see that the MacBook Air is a little bit choppier in those animations. Some people, a lot of people, probably don't care as much about the ProMotion, but there are other benefits to the mini LED as well. It has a much higher contrast ratio, like 1,000,000:1, versus I think like 1,000:1 on the MacBook Air. Additionally, it's far brighter. MacBook Air only gets to be about 500 nits of brightness. Let's see if we can go ahead and bump this all the way up. We're on camera here. This is max brightness on our MacBook Air. But if I go to my iPad Pro and I bump all the way this up, this has a standard brightness of 600, but you can already see a big difference between the brightness of these displays. This can also go up to 1,000 nits for XDR content, HDR content, but it has a peak brightness of 1,600 nits for really, peak brightness during HDR or XDR playback. That is a big benefit. If you're using this outside, the iPad Pro is absolutely a brighter display. Though, of course, you're going to take a hit in battery life at the same time. What about the cameras? Here, the iPad Pro is the easy winner. iPad has multiple cameras. You've got two here on the back, the ultra-wide and the standard lens, and you have a LiDAR scanner, which can be used for things like measurement and 3D mappings of rooms and all sorts of crazy fun stuff. But it also has its front-facing cameras that are also powerful. They enable the True Depth camera system for authenticating on your iPad, which is faster and more passive than having to use the Touch ID here on the MacBook Air. And that front-facing camera has support for things like center stage and for portrait mode. You don't have all of those features here on the upgraded 1080p camera of the MacBook Air. And if you're wondering what the quality looks like for those front-facing cameras, here is a comparison in this same lighting on both machines. I'll let you judge for yourself which one is better. I think that the iPad Pro has the better camera here. It has more features, and you have the benefits of all the rear-facing cameras. Even if you don't ever really use these, it's nicer to have them than not have them if I was comparing these two devices. Another feature to discuss is the speakers. Each of these has a 4-speaker system, but I think the iPad Pro sounds a bit better, which I was surprised about. Apple did just upgrade the speakers in the MacBook Air, but they sound a little bit smaller than the iPad Pro. They feel a little bit like they have more bass, a little bit fuller. Neither are particularly impressive compared to dedicated standalone speakers, but I would lean towards iPad Pro as having the better of the two. That brings me to battery life. And here, the MacBook Air is the champ. Easily. The iPad Pro has good battery life. And I do mostly writing on here, but when I connect it to my Magic Keyboard and I start writing, I can get 5, maybe 6 or so hours out of a single charge. Definitely not all day for me. I have much longer than 5 to 6 hour work days. But the MacBook Air, it easily goes all day. This is a much better battery life. The actual battery cell is larger than the iPad, but it also just lasts longer. I don't know if it's because the M2 is more efficient or just macOS versus iPadOS, but I'm definitely getting much better battery life here on the MacBook Air than on my iPad Pro. I do need to talk about performance, but it's a little fickle for me to test out on my actual devices here. Because while I do have the MacBook Air and it's running the latest version of macOS, my iPad Pro is currently on the iPadOS 16 beta. So running things like Geekbench, I am not getting the latest numbers. But we do know that the iPad Pro has the M1 processor and the MacBook Air has the M2 processor. The M2 builds on the M1 by allowing for faster memory, and you can have more memory. The MacBook Air can go up to 24 gigs of memory, while the iPad Pro only goes up to 16 on the higher configurations. You also have a difference in terms of the video encode and decode engines. There are dedicated engines on the new M2 compared to the M1, so video processing should be better here on the MacBook Air. Finally, the cores of the MacBook Air's M2 chip are faster than those of the M1 inside of the iPad Pro, and there are additional graphics cores, so it's a higher graphics performance on the MacBook Air compared to the iPad Pro. While I didn't want to go into a bunch of benchmarks on it, I can say, at least in using the machines, they both feel incredibly snappy. The M1 is no slouch at all. I mean, it's a freaking Mac M1 chip in an iPad, and it runs blazing fast. Like literally jumping between apps and moving between things, even during a beta where animations can be laggy, it's incredibly smooth. So I didn't have any problems with it, but the M2 is a newer chip, and we're likely going to have an M2 iPad Pro by the end of the year or beginning of next year, so it's coming, and it'll be quicker. But I don't think it alone is the reason to wait or kind of choose the MacBook Air over the iPad Pro. So which machine should you buy? For most of you out there, without knowing what you're doing, I would tell you to buy the iPad Pro. I think there's more options here to play around with. I mean, I love the fact that it is a convertible design between a tablet or a laptop, depending on your workload, and you can connect a keyboard and a mouse to it wirelessly. I love that it has Face ID over Touch ID. I love that it has more cameras. It supports Apple Pencil. You can outfit it with 5G if you want to get cellular connectivity, and it has a touchscreen. All things that the MacBook Air doesn't have. But it also gets fairly expensive. You start adding on 5G and more storage and Apple Pencil and a Magic Keyboard, and you're paying a lot more money for an iPad Pro than you are for a MacBook Air that's just ready to go out of the box. MacBook Air is also great for anyone who just wants a traditional laptop experience. You don't need the touchscreen, and you want to be able to reliably run those desktop applications. And you don't want to have to rely on mobile versions of apps for everything on the iPad Pro. Depending on your setup, the MacBook Air can also be thinner and lighter than an iPad Pro with a Magic Keyboard, so that's also a benefit, and it has many more ports than the iPad Pro does. In the end, it is going to depend on you, your workflow, and which makes more sense. Both these are crazy good devices. I love iPadOS, and I really tend to lean towards the iPad versus the MacBook Air, but the new MacBook Air is stellar, and I would happily recommend it to anybody who wants that laptop experience and wants a better version of it than previous versions of the MacBook Air. Let me know what you guys think. And if you want to grab either an iPad Pro or a MacBook Air, we started gathering deals, and there's some good discounts down below in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments or on Twitter at Andrew_OSU, and stay tuned, I have a lot more videos coming your way.